Hello all and welcome to the YouTube channel of All Day Chess. We'll first start with the beginner series on how to take your first steps to your chess journey and eventually play in some chess tournaments. Well, before we get started, let's see what we're going to cover in this video. In this video, we're going to cover on how to set up the board, where the pieces go, how the pieces move, and at the end, a few special moves. Well, before we get started, if you don't want to miss any videos at all, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the bell. And if you liked the video, make sure to leave us a like. Well, let's get started with a tiny bit of history here. Chess is believed to originate from India before the 7th century, and it's played by millions worldwide. And I hope you're one among them very soon. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get started. This is a chessboard. It's an 8x8 grid, a total of 64 squares. When you start in your chess game, there's 2 players, and each of them play a color. Usually, it's black and white. So, let's say I'm playing the black pieces. I need to make sure I have a light square on my right. And let's say you're playing the white pieces. You need to make sure you have a light square on your right too. So if the board was set up like this, it would be incorrect because both of us on our right have dark squares. So this is the correct board. In your chessboard, your army takes control of these 2 rows closest towards you. And for me, these 2 rows which are closest towards me. In the second to last row, you'll have a bunch of soldiers, which in the chess world are called pawns. So you have 8 white pawns, and I have 8 white pawns, which makes there a total of 16 pawns on the board. The pawns aren't very powerful, but they become very crucial in the middle game. So now we'll start out, what about this back rank? Well, this back rank includes your big pieces, like the tanks in a battlefield. So your big pieces start out with your rooks. Each side has 2 rooks, which go on the extreme corners of the board. Same for the other color. And make sure when you set up your board that all pieces face the opposite. So as you can see, this white rook faces this black rook, and this white rook faces this black rook, and vice versa. And then you start out with your knights. No, they are not called horses, they are called knights. Your knights are very special, and we'll see how they move in a couple minutes. Your knights go right next to your rook on both sides, and same for your white pieces. The next piece you have is called a bishop. Your bishops go next to your knight, and they are closest to your most important pieces. So, what are your most important pieces? Well, your most important pieces in a chessboard and your most important chess piece is the queen and the king. So, you might say, which is more important? Well, it's hard to decide, as the queen is the most powerful, but the king seals the game's fate. So each side has to have a king on their opponent's color. So as you can see, the white king has to be on a dark square. So the black king must be on a light square. Yep. And the queen, though, is more loyal. The queen is on its own color. So the white queen will be on the white square, and the black queen will be on the black square. So now let's get started and see how the pieces move. The easiest piece to learn how to move is the rook. The rook either moves sideways or up and down. It's pretty straightforward. So for example, if there was one of black's soldier pawns right here, the rook could move here, here, here. So the best move would be to move here and capture that black pawn. So next comes the bishop. The bishop is very similar to the rook, except it cannot move like this. Instead, it has the scope of a diagonal, so it can move all the way back and all the way front, though it cannot jump over any pieces. And you might be surprised, is there a piece that can jump over other pieces? Well, there is, and we'll get to that. But for now, the most important piece and the most powerful, the queen. The queen is the most powerful because it has the powers of a bishop and rook combined. The queen can move this way, and it can move diagonally, which gives it supreme abilities. The last piece in your back rank is a knight. Knights are very tricky pieces as they don't have a diagonal or a row to move in. Instead, they move in an L or a backward L. The L, you have to go 1 square and then 2 squares in the same direction. I know that's a bit confusing, but here's what I mean. Let's say the knight's here. The knight can move 1 square in this direction and then 2 squares up, and the knight will end up here. And you might ask, how can the knight go? Because there's pieces in the way. Well, the knight has a special ability which no other piece on the board has. The knight can jump over pieces. For example, let's say there is a piece here, right? The knight can go to these squares. backwards on the edge, here, 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 right? So the knight has a special ability to go here and jump over the pawn and land here. And also, a cool thing about the knight is it can also do that to pieces. So a knight can jump over and take a piece. So that's the ability of a knight. Last but not least, there are pawns. Pawns only move one square, except on their very first time you move the pawn. So let's say white's turn to move, as white always starts the game. White moves its pawn first. White can either choose to move its pawn one square, or it has a special ability since the pawn has not been moved yet, the pawn can move 2 squares. And same with black. Though once the pawn has been moved, it cannot move 2 squares again. As right now, you might be thinking the white pawn could capture the black pawn, but that's not true, because pawns capture in a different way. Pawns can only capture diagonally, so you would be right if a white pawn could capture a black pawn here, because it would be a capture diagonally, which is allowed. Though if there's a position like this, the white pawn cannot capture the black pawn, as it's not diagonal. And later on in the game, let's say you move a couple pieces. Now the pawn cannot come here, because it's already moved 2 squares on its first turn. Now, if you want to move the pawn, the only square possible is up 1. So that's how you move the pieces in pawns. So now let's get started with the special moves. Special moves later on in the game include castling. Castling is where you have nothing left. Your knight's developed, your pawn's moved so your bishop can move, and you have these 2 pieces sitting alone. Instead of moving your rook here, which would leave your king out in the open and which would allow enemy pieces to come and attack it, you have a special thing called castling, where you can move your king 2 squares and your rook over. Oops, I forgot to mention that, but the king can only move 1 square at a time. So the king could move here and here, but it cannot move 2 squares by itself and leave the rook here. So the king, when it castles, it has a special ability as the king goes 2 squares and the rook can jump over the king and come here. Castling is a very important part in chess, and you will need it to survive in your middle games. Well, you might be wondering, what other special rule is there? Well, chess is pretty straightforward, but there's one other special rule, and it's called en passant. It's a French term which means in passing. For example, let's say there is a white pawn here. You know that if a black pawn comes to this square, white can capture it. Agreed? But if black decides he doesn't want white to capture and he tries to play tricky and move it 2 squares up, well, you can be even trickier and capture it back because of the rule called en passant. But this is not always the case, as if a pawn is here and a pawn is here, you cannot capture it. Though, if a pawn is here and a pawn moves 2 squares, avoiding the capture, that is when you are able to capture it. And these are the special rules in chess. Hope you enjoy the video, and see you next time.